In August 2025, French President Emmanuel Macron made headlines around the world when he broke with traditional diplomatic protocol, choosing to publish an open letter addressed directly to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, rather than communicating through private channels. This was not a discreet diplomatic message, but a bold public demand for Israel to fundamentally change its approach in Gaza, and a call for accountability on the world stage. Macron's unprecedented move exposed a widening rift between France and Israel, two nations that had long been close allies, but now found themselves deeply divided after nearly 2 years of relentless conflict. Tensions had been simmering since the October 2023 Hamas attacks, but the immediate spark for Macron's letter was Netanyahu's accusation that France's support for Palestinian statehood was fueling anti-Semitism, a claim that deeply angered French officials. Macron's response was unequivocal. The era of quiet, behind-the-scenes diplomacy was over. He insisted that the world could no longer look away. By publishing the letter in major French newspapers, Macron sought to rally not only governments, but also the global public, urging citizens everywhere to demand action and accountability. He framed the conflict as a crisis with worldwide implications, challenging Israel's moral standing and warning that continued inaction would only deepen its international isolation. Macron's letter forced urgent, uncomfortable questions into the open for leaders and citizens alike. How can Israel defend itself without crossing the line and violating humanitarian principles? What are the limits of self-defense in modern warfare? And how should the world respond to the immense suffering of Gaza's civilians, caught in the crossfire and facing a deepening humanitarian crisis? For France and many Western nations, Macron's message was unmistakable. The status quo was no longer acceptable, and the world could not afford to remain silent any longer. At the heart of Macron's letter was a blunt demand: the war in Gaza must end now. The French president emphasized the urgency of the situation, highlighting the immense human suffering and the destabilizing effects of the ongoing conflict. Macron argued that Israel's campaign, once aimed at dismantling Hamas, had become a destructive, endless conflict. He pointed out that the initial objectives had long been overshadowed by the sheer scale of destruction and loss of life. Nearly 2 years of fighting had failed to eliminate Hamas, but had devastated Gaza's civilians and fueled future extremism. The humanitarian crisis was deepening, with countless families displaced and infrastructure in ruins. Macron insisted that military force alone could never bring true security to Israel. He stressed that a sustainable peace could only be achieved through dialogue and mutual understanding. He called for a credible political alternative, not more violence. Diplomacy, he argued, was the only viable path forward. The letter carried personal weight. Over 50 French citizens were killed in the initial Hamas attack, and hostages remained in danger. Macron's appeal was not just political but deeply personal, reflecting the grief and anxiety of the affected families. Macron argued that only a ceasefire could secure their release and prevent further tragedy. He underscored the importance of immediate action to save lives and restore hope. His call was strategic as well as moral. The war was draining Israel's resources, damaging its reputation, and trapping it in a quagmire. The economic and social costs were mounting, making the conflict unsustainable. Macron urged Israel to pivot from endless war to building peace, starting with an immediate halt to the fighting. He envisioned a future where both Israelis and Palestinians could coexist peacefully. He warned, continuing on the current path would only deepen Israel's isolation and insecurity. The international community, he noted, was watching closely and urging a change in course. Macron's letter delivered a stinging critique of Israel's conduct in Gaza. He accused Israel of humiliation on the world stage, losing its moral authority and alienating even close allies. Macron condemned the occupation, forced displacement, starvation, and annexation in the West Bank as indefensible and illegal. He argued these actions would not bring victory, but perpetual conflict and isolation. The humanitarian disaster, Macron said, was a stain on Israel's founding principles. He warned that such policies emboldened extremists and fueled global anti-Semitism, making Israel less safe. Macron's message: Israel was sacrificing its security and democracy for a brutal, short-sighted campaign. The world, he insisted, could no longer remain silent. The battle for hearts and minds, Macron warned, was being lost. Netanyahu's government hit back, accusing France's recognition of a Palestinian state of fueling modern anti-Semitism. He argued that singling out Israel while ignoring other conflicts was a double standard, and that supporting Palestinian statehood rewarded terrorism. Netanyahu linked criticism of Israel to a surge in anti-Semitic incidents across Europe, seeking to delegitimize his critics. The US ambassador to France echoed these claims, escalating the dispute into a transatlantic controversy. France responded by formally reprimanding the ambassador, a rare diplomatic move. Netanyahu's strategy was to shift the debate from Gaza's war to the motivations of Israel's critics. By invoking anti-Semitism, he aimed to silence dissent and rally support at home and abroad. The tactic reframed Israel as a victim, not an aggressor. Macron's response to the anti-Semitism accusation was swift and fierce. He called Netanyahu's claim unacceptable and an insult to France. Macron rejected the idea that criticism of Israeli policy equated to anti-Semitism, calling it a dangerous political ploy. He warned that weaponizing anti-Semitism undermined the real fight against anti-Jewish hatred. Macron pointed to France's record deploying thousands to protect Jewish sites and passing strong anti-hate laws. He insisted France's commitment to fighting anti-Semitism was beyond reproach. Turning the argument, Macron accused Netanyahu's Gaza policies of inflaming tensions and endangering Jews worldwide. His message defending Israel's actions by invoking anti-Semitism was reckless and harmful. The clash unfolded as France and other Western nations prepared to recognize a Palestinian state, a move that would send shockwaves through the international community and mark a turning point in Middle Eastern diplomacy. In July 2025, President Emmanuel Macron announced that France would push for official recognition of Palestine at the United Nations, breaking with decades of diplomatic caution and signaling a bold new approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Macron argued that this decision was not meant to be anti-Israel, but rather a necessary and overdue step toward peace after years of failed negotiations and mounting frustration on all sides. Recognition, he insisted, was about preserving the possibility of a two-state solution and offering hope to Palestinians who had long felt abandoned by the international community. France's move was soon joined by the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, forming a powerful coalition of Western nations determined to shift the diplomatic landscape and send a clear message to both sides. This dramatic shift reflected deep frustration with the status quo, a growing impatience with endless stalemates, and a desire among Western leaders to break the deadlock that had persisted for decades. For Israel, the move was seen as not only hostile, but also as a decision that could embolden its enemies and further complicate an already volatile situation in the region. For Macron and his allies, however, it was viewed as the last available tool to revive peace talks and prevent the complete collapse of the two-state vision. The hope was that formal recognition would reset the conflict, create new momentum for a political solution, and finally open the door to a lasting peace in the region. Macron's letter centered on the catastrophic human toll in Gaza. He condemned the destruction of homes, hospitals, and infrastructure, calling the suffering of civilians unjustifiable. Forced displacement, starvation, and the blockade had pushed Gaza to the brink of famine. Macron held Israel directly responsible for these policy choices, calling them violations of international law. The humanitarian crisis, he argued, was not just a tragedy, but a strategic disaster for Israel. Images of suffering were eroding global support and isolating Israel further. Macron signaled that France's foreign policy would be guided by humanitarian principles. He declared the well-being of Palestinians a central concern, demanding an immediate end to hostilities. The message peace and security are impossible while this catastrophe continues. Macron's letter was a warning from a friend. Israel's current path was leading to dangerous isolation. He argued that actions in Gaza and the West Bank were alienating even Israel's closest allies. The coordinated recognition of Palestine by Western nations signaled a fracturing consensus. Macron linked Israel's isolation to a rise in global anti-Semitism, a painful paradox. He warned that current policies were making Jews worldwide less safe, not more. Macron urged Israel to rejoin the international community by respecting law and pursuing peace. The choice, he said, was clear: continue unilateral action and face condemnation, or change course and work for lasting peace. True strength, Macron insisted, lies in alliances and moral leadership. Macron's letter ended with a call for a two-state solution as the only path to lasting peace. He argued that only a viable, independent Palestinian state alongside Israel could guarantee security and end endless conflict. Military force, Macron said, could never defeat an ideology like Hamas. A credible political path would empower moderates and marginalize extremists. Macron referenced a joint French-Saudi day after plan international security in Gaza, disarmament and reconstruction under new Palestinian leadership. This, he argued, was a real alternative to endless war. Macron framed the two-state solution as the fulfillment of Israel's founding vision, a secure democratic state at peace with its neighbors. The current path, he warned, threatened that dream. His final plea: peace requires vision and courage, two states for two peoples side by side.